So good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Ethics Centre, I would like to welcome you to the 2019 Weinberger Vermut Genetics Ethics Lecture. In particular, I would like to welcome you on behalf of Dr. Clarence Braddock, the new Interim Director of the Centre, who is unfortunately unable to attend this afternoon due to a long-standing prior commitment. He asked me, however, to extend his sincere thanks of the Centre to Tom and to Leslie Weinberger, who so generously sponsor this annual lecture and who are in so many ways, and we hope will remain, stalwart friends and benefactors of the Ethics Centre. Thank you, Tom. If you would stand. This afternoon's speaker is Dr. Despina Kakudaki. Dr. Kakudaki is an Associate Professor of Literature and Director of the Humanities Lab at American University, Washington, D.C. I am also very happy to say that she is an alumna of the D.C. system itself, earning both her master's and her PhD from the University of California in Berkeley. Upon completion of her doctorate, she was appointed Assistant Professor in Comparative Literature at Harvard, and after 6 years at Harvard, she moved in 2017 to her current appointment. Dr. Kakudaki's current work focuses on film, which I'm told I pronounce with 2 syllables, which I'm not supposed to do, film and media studies, cultural studies, literature, and the history of technology. Her most recent book, The Anatomy of a Robot, Literature, Cinema, and the Cultural Work of Artificial People, traces the history and cultural function of the mechanical or constructed person in both pre-modern and modern cultural contexts. She has written also on the absence of ecology in Game of Thrones, on the bicentennial of the novel Frankenstein, on robots and cyborgs. I had to ask my fellow what a cyborg was, on race and melodrama in science fiction and disaster movies, on contagion narratives, and on the political role, most intriguingly of all, I thought, of the pin-up during World War II. The mind boggles. This talk today is part of her larger research project on questions of global culture. Fact, they say, is stranger than fiction. Nowhere is this more true than in relation to scientific fact, and perhaps most true of the biomedical sciences. How much more strange, therefore, when this type of fact is itself fictionalized in turn. Therefore, it is with great pleasure and anticipation that I invite Dr. Kakudaki to give the 2019 Weinberger Vermut Genetic Ethics Lecture, which is entitled Contagion Narratives and Genetic Fears, Research Ethics in the Popular Imagination. Dr. Kakudaki.
Hello, thank you everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for this great, very generous introduction. Also thank you to Tom Weinberger and Leslie Vermut for endowing this lecture series and for supporting my work. And also to Stuart Finder, who isn't here today, but he was one of the people who encouraged me to present on this particular topic, which is a little bit information, let's say right now. So part of the thing that I feel like I track a lot in my work is the relationship of body to context. And so that's why the pinups make sense with robots and cyborgs, with the representation of race in melodrama and disaster movies. There's something about figuring out what the body means and how the body creates meanings or allows us for the projection of meanings. And this project comes from an idea that I'm calling sometimes small world. It's pretty bad, but okay. Where I'm thinking about the interactions between some things that we experience today at a very much bigger scale than we ever did before, at a global scale, and some things that we are experiencing at the smallest possible scale that we have ever experienced, which is the scale of genetics, DNA testing, but also proton research, quantum physics, all of those things that unite this tiny, tiny material world with this very, very big global context. There are lots of seats come. And so one of the things that fascinates me is how these two really huge expansions of the scale of the human reaffirm what we must understand as the scale of the human, right? So it's a little bit in that context. For example, in terms of looking at the global notion that we have today, global connectivity, we have media technologies, we have the internet as a global factor, we have things that are concerning for us now, like globalization in terms of the movements of capital, thinking about the environment, climate, and ecology, which forces us to think about the world as a much more connected place. But we also, as a result, have lost a certain boundary between what's local or what's close and what's far. Right? Notions of distance are very different in this context now. Somebody could be doing something in their basement, let's say in Seattle, or let's say in Ukraine, and it might affect the American elections, or it might affect your pacemaker. And so the idea of like action at a distance, the idea of things that are local and global or things that are far away, some of these notions of distance and also therefore safety or enclosed boundaries are deteriorating partly because of the way that the world works now. The world feels bigger, but it is less understandable in some ways, less controllable. The more we know, the more we don't actually control how much we need to know. And my question for that is like, what are the moments in which we think about the Earth as one? And that is a really strange question because in fact, the Earth is the largest object that we can directly experience, right? It is the largest entity that we can directly experience. We can look at the stars, we can speculate about other things, but we are directly experiencing the Earth. And so on the one hand, it's very familiar. On the other hand, it's also too big to actually be experienced as one. So there's something about the loss of coherence there and the boundary of distance. The small world in relation to these deep spaces of matter fascinates me because it actually creates completely different forms of alienation. We're looking at things in DNA research, genetics, genomics, a lot of new emphasis on imaging technologies, which create their own challenge because they give us what images always give us, which is new exteriors. Right? An image is never an interior. An image is capturing the exterior of that interior. Right? So there's something interesting about how images also challenge us to train ourselves again, to see, to understand. I think that from my very distant, not clinical point of view, I think that the emphasis in all of these deep spaces has given us a real interest in liminal states, beginning of life questions, end of life questions that connect to a lot of political questions and a lot of ethical questions about choice. And choice becomes related to the personal, and so that's why the scale of the human becomes redefined given this small deep space now. So we have a different sense here of the limit between small and big, right? Or between interior and exterior that is also being challenged by contemporary technological innovations and also imaging innovations. And some of these things are experienced as a loss of coherence again, or a loss of safety. Right? The self is permeable or the self is undefinable in some way. So for me, it feels like if I could summarize just in one place these ethical questions from the point of view of realities, right? We have certain ethical issues that I'm sure that you deal with in a lot more complex ways than I can do here. Thinking about access, thinking about consent, thinking about what happens to genetic materials like, your nail clippings or umbilical cord. What happens to genetic materials that used to be discarded but somehow now are possible sources for information? Does this notion of the private extend to them? And does it extend differently to these materials? Questions about surveillance, ownership, privatization are really endemic in this because we're dealing in a capitalist and global environment in which information has effects, information is meaningful. Questions of security and cybersecurity also pose their own ethical conundrums. And the biggest issue is a type of problem of privatization. Does data become private, but not private anymore like my private data, but private like my photographs belong to Google, or my photographs belong to Facebook. And that is a translatable problem across media platforms. It isn't just about genetic material, it is about all the material we generate. And as you probably all have experienced, we have the main problem in terms of how the public understands these things, which is a lot of fantasy spaces about what we can control, controlling the next generation, controlling the gene, controlling what your kids will look like, all of those things that have nothing to do with what the research can actually prove or what science can actually do, but they belong into a phantasmatic realm that I think is always in operation. A lot of misunderstandings about these things. Another couple of contemporary factors is that now we have a massive production of genetic material, and it is produced much more in the research that I've done in the healthcare sector rather than in the research sector. A research study might have a certain number of subjects, but a hospital could test everybody who's pregnant. Right? At some point, if that becomes interesting to people or becomes possible for people, and that creates massive amounts of data that are completely in a different place. So some of the questions that researchers now have are about accessing these things, and that also becomes a question of locality. Does data that is generated in a hospital in Denmark, does it belong to humankind in some way? Right? Does it belong to research communities in some way that should break national barriers and that they should break disciplinary barriers even, right? Does data generated in a study about leukemia belong also to a person who might be studying HIV, right? So there's something about another type of boundary there. So the book that James was mentioning, my book, Anatomy of a Robot, was about the figure of the artificial person, the artificial body. And I was thinking about it as a trope, as a discourse, thinking about it as a type of structural and long-standing metaphor about the body. And some of the things that make sense to me in that context are about how we imagine the body as mechanical. We imagine mechanical people, artificial people, mechanical bodies as having some kind of answer or solution to the questions or the problems of the body. And one of the things, the reason I mentioned it as anatomy of a robot, like I kind of meant it in terms of robots, because we always want to look inside robots somehow. We open their faces, we open their chests. There's something fascinating about looking inside the body, but also because I think anatomy is actually an operative concept here in terms of how we understand the body and its specific coherence. So for example, some of the older imaging of the body in relation to body coherence, this is from Vesalius, for example, are still very much conceptually powerful in contemporary culture because they give us a sense of systemic order. Here are the nerves. Here is the skeleton. Here are the arteries. Here are the superficial muscles. And in a way, very often when we think of the body today, we still have that kind of strange concentric organization, which has nothing to do with the reality of the lived body or the reality of the body as you might meet it in medical contexts, right? Or even in personal contexts, where it's full of fluids, for example. It's full of things that might have strange emissions or strange smells. This clean visual body has none of that problem, right? And so it has a kind of a conceptual power that is organizable. When I was working on artificial people, I was fascinated by the way in which these body systems also really coincide with how we imagine artificial people to be created. Take any one of the systems and replace it with an artificial alternative, and you have an artificial person, somebody who has, latex skin, or somebody who has electric nerves, right? The logic of this kind of concentric, organized, systemic body is also the logic of the artificial body. And very often we even have kind of the readability of these images as making an implicit logic of construction of the body, even though they themselves have nothing to do with the robot tradition that I study. So for example, this idea of the man's leg progressively anatomized, if you read the image from right to left, it is a leg that keeps losing layers until it just becomes the bones, in some kind of uncanny way still able to stand. That's what they're all doing in that era. If you read it from left to right, it is a body that is getting clothed into its muscles to become a full leg. But there's some kind of coherence in thinking about these as stages of the same thing, or as developments in the same thing. Some of this logic of body coherence continues even when we're looking at X-ray imaging, because X-ray imaging also retains that concentric circles, the onion model. Take the skin off, you take the muscles off, take the nerves off, like you have until you get the skeleton, which I think is really dominant in how people understand the body in contemporary culture. This is an art piece, it's not a reality, so it's a simulation of imagining an X-ray town. There is no way that you could misunderstand what these people are as non-people. It's like, of course, these are humans, right? There's something very completely easy that X-ray imaging allows us to have. And then I'm going to show you some medical images, and I kept the captions that I use for my students, which explain what is an MRI, which isn't the audience level. Once we get into more contemporary complex images, we have a different logic that isn't the logic of concentric circles. It might still retain recognizability immediately about what image this is, but different types of images like this one from the Visible Human Project, in which a cadaver was sliced vertically and horizontally, if you take them completely out of context, it just looks like meat. It just looks like a mess of things that has too much contiguity. Everything is close together. The fat and the tendons and the contents of the stomach are all next to each other. There's some kind of strange lack of distance that is the origin of the Vesalian system's distance, right? The bones are over here and the muscles are over here. When we get even deeper in matter, we're looking at things that would not even be described as recognizable for a general public. If I asked a student, draw me a picture, or a kid, draw me a picture of a piece of the human, a piece of your body, I don't know that they would draw this, and they wouldn't recognize this as a piece of their body, but it is one of the most intimate pieces of their body, right? And there's a certain beauty and a certain alienation in this kind of imaging that we see. These are all images from real research rather than images from data modeling, which I will kind of question a little bit in a second. So something about going deeper in matter also alienates what we imagine again as the scale of the human, which in popular culture has imprinted into a Renaissance model of what the human looks like. In order to complicate this, I want to say that actually a lot of the images we have in general could bear more pressure in how we accept them and how we accept their status as images that deliver reality and understanding. This image, for example, out of context, could be anything, right? But in fact, it is one of the first of the images that showed the Earth from above, the highest distance that anybody had reached at the time, 1946, which was on a V2 rocket, captured German rocket. And it was right before images that became more visible and more popular, such as the image of the blue marble that I showed in my first slide. So trying in the 40s and early 50s to actually piece together what the world looks like from a distance, right, leads to images like this, composites that are not necessarily giving you coherent pictures of a whole, but show you the process of discernment. Or the first image from a sublunar orbit, which is, the Earth is the little half moon in there. And again, it has this kind of beautiful graininess that feels very artistic, but it is, the furthest away anybody had ever been until the blue marble picture that we think has complete meaning, right? So the blue marble picture is my counterpoint in the big world of the Vesalian image of the body, of like the body has coherence, and it's like, haha, look, the Earth has one. Right? And in fact, some people are analyzing the emergence of images like this as the beginning of the environmentalist movement, the beginning of thinking about the Earth as one organism or one ecosystem, coincides with the rise in systems theory, chaos theory about, a butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazon and it rains in London, right? The idea of connectivity and causes and effects spread over the face of the Earth. At the level of the DNA, I also love these alienated images. I love the image. Photo 51 is one of the first images that shows you a crystallized DNA X-ray. I love the idea that I don't know at all what that is. On the other side, you have a contemporary computer model, which is very beautifully done, and it has all this perfect orchestration of things that, again, is an art piece, right? It isn't actually, DNA is not photographable in that way. In fact, when DNA becomes photographable, it is another strange alien landscape in which many, many strands, I think there are 7 strands of DNA are spread on these 2 nanopillars. So we're in a very, very deep level of the body here. Actually, not even on the body, of body-related materials, right? Because it's not inside our body, this imaging. So that you can see a little bit of the corkscrew kind of effect. And then all of these things become summarized again in other images that have incredible cultural power, like images of automated sequencing, which then also become computerized versions of like just very pretty colors. So again, if I look at an image like this, I might think this is an iStock photo. This is a stock photo of contemporary ideas about data. I don't know if if a picture is like this, right? There doesn't seem to be any necessity that that data is related to my body, right? It is a completely disconnected visual realm. And there are, here's a little example of some of these problems. When we're looking at the realities and the fantasies of this level of interaction with the deep spaces of matter, we're looking at the promises, for example, of precision medicine or the promises of genomics research, especially in thinking about how to understand the body, how to interpret the body, how to interpret the potential for certain types of disease. And the idea of recognizing modeling our knowledge, right? Recognizing epistemologies that respect the body from a bottom-up kind of direction, which means the body is doing something that we try to understand, or the body knows or is aware of something or is responding to something that our knowledge may or may not encompass yet. The contrast to that is a lot of fantasies about what powers we have, that we have the power to control life and death or control the next generation, that we are trying to create immunity or new boundaries for disease, which returns to a much more old-fashioned dualistic thinking about the body, which is again top-down, right? The level of knowledge will allow me to control what the body is doing. And you see both of those things in contemporary culture. You see the way in which we say, I don't know, try gluten-free and see if that works. I don't know, it kind of works for some people, right? In which case you think of the body as a black box of like, I'm not really sure what all these enzymes and proteins are thinking in that meeting they're having, but give them this other food and see if it works, right? Which is, I think, a kind of a bottom-up understanding of there might be things we cannot interpret, versus even at the same level of food and diet. And I'll give you an example about this, which is I know the provenance of everything that I eat, right? Which is a much more controlled vocabulary. If I could summarize just the biggest issues about these 2 things, the realities and the fantasies, I think that on the one hand, we have an emergence of a much more ecological thinking about the body, of putting the self in these radical scales that go from bacteria to the cosmos. And the human is somewhere in there. And inside the human is another ecology that goes from, DNA, genetics, protein inhibitors, like all kinds of behaviors and expressions that we don't even have language to describe how dynamic they are and how changing they are. And also a self that still wants to have coherent experiences with a sense of body, a sense of self, a sense of futurity, a sense of behavior, demeanor. And then on the other hand, we have this kind of retrogressive, I think, fantasies, which is about a new reaffirmed duality. Medicine is going to be the champion that will help us control this bizarre, uncontrollable ecological body and make more sense of it and make it discipline it in a new way, right? And I think that I'm making it very schematic and very exaggerated on purpose, but I think that we all deal with this kind of conflict constantly. It's not an easy question to resolve. So if you think about things that are going on in the microbiome, I used to call it the biodome, which just to make it more science fictional. But if you think about what's happening now in terms of how people are thinking about just like gut bacteria, right? They're thinking about the gut, or they're thinking about the biome, the human biome, as an organ, right? So incorporating into the body, it's not other. They might think about them as inhabitants, right? It's the things that also live with me that are sometimes symbiotic and sometimes pathogenic. Or you might think about it as a community. We're all working together so that I can live and finish my degree, right? God, please work with me, right? So there's some kind of interesting way in which all of these languages are coexisting right now in how we understand this. And one of those, I have this note about this image because I'm fascinated in the images that get produced for this kind of analysis. It's always showing the food in the brain, but it isn't showing you the brain in the gut. Right? It isn't showing you that 90% of receptors, of serotonin receptors are in the gut. Like it can't show you that. We don't have an image style to show that. And also one of the dimensions that has been really popular and also kind of dangerous, I think, which is to think about the self now as dispersed and dissolved And this is from an article that became quite central for a while in the discussions of the biome, to think about the self as a plural, as a superorganism, and also the apocalyptic kind of narratives of, it turns out that we are only 10% human, because the rest is the 90% of the biome, that is the gut bacteria, blah, blah, right? And also the problematic component that you see here again in terms of control, which is, if you look at the part at the very end, to the extent that we are bearers of genetic information, more than 99% of it is microbial. And this is like the second genome, which is where the control narrative enters in. It's like, okay, you can't control your genetic makeup, but you could control the second genome, which is 90% of your genome, which is your bacteria. Right? So you can see that even in an article that actually is trying to create a popularized understanding of the biome, you get these sudden vocabularies of control. You have a lot of control over your body, and this is one of the places that you want to control. So one of the things that is happening in a large scale, that even in genetics research, I think we feel, but it's also happening in anything that has to do with data, is the proliferation of models about data and about information that we all experience in so many radical aspects of our lives. And when everything becomes data, you have a slightly synesthetic world. Images, audio files, memories, medical records, my transcript from high school, somehow all of them live in the same place, which is a digital environment, and they all become the same thing, which is some version of code. Right? And so you get this kind of paranoid components in contemporary culture about what it means to become code, what it means to be encoded, what it means for those things to all be data. And I think that both narratives of control and narratives of this kind of spectacle of threat, spectacle of the dissolution of boundaries, I think these are all responses, cultural responses to both the idea of things as being data and also the idea of certain things that used to have particular boundaries don't have those boundaries anymore. Something is lost when we describe things in terms of data, even as we also find so many more sources of information and excitement for the future, right? For possibilities, for options about care. So let me give you an example from Westworld, for example, which is a TV show that came out a few years ago, and it is a revision of a TV show from a movie from 1973. Because I work on artificial people, I'm always following these narratives of designing people. And when you can design any body you want, any type of person you want in the science fiction world, what you do design ends up carrying quite a lot of baggage about what you think bodies are and what you think needs to be there, right? You have absolute freedom. Why not design a person who has 7 eyes and 4 octopus tentacles? But instead, no, it is all about creating very specific, often stereotypical, very invested, gendered versions of the body that we see in those things. So in addition to having some of that spectacular vocabulary of displacement, of people that are disposable, of people that are easy to cut into, that create different types of logic about the body, in addition to also having a lot about trauma and a lot about representing the ego, right, representing the self as something that is the effect of trauma, it also talks a lot about consciousness almost as software, that you have upgrades, you have bugs in the system, you have builds, you have erasures, right, which is a really problematic but also really powerful convergence of the world of data that I'm talking about, thinking about things as data and the world in which we are embodied beings. And one of the things, for example, from that show is that they have invented these artificial people who staff this amusement park, and they can monitor and also adjust everything about them, including their character, their mood, their vivacity, whether they are loyal or not, right? And this is not a unique example. You see other versions of that cultural fantasy of being able to control mood. In the science fiction context, it is about control by passing trauma and imagining ourselves as programmable. But it is still fueled by something that is part of our reality of cultural experience now, which is the effect of things like pharmacology, new drugs, or things that are related to mood, or mental environments, or mental models of how we understand the self. And on the one hand, we are expanding what we think neurotypicality is, and on the other hand, we are thinking of it as malleable, right? That you could actually change or alter all these things. And it does have a little bit of a strange translation from what we understand now about drugs and how drugs can alter mood, or hormones and how they alter mood, or food, right? How it can alter mood. And then to get all the way to the science fiction vocabulary where altering mood or altering a self could be as easy as programming your, I think almost iPod in the way that they are doing it there. So I get from all of these kinds of things as a context in order to then understand something about this global context of threat. Right, and again, it is as I know that some of the changes of scale are vertiginous, and in a way, I really want them. I want you to think with me about these changes of scale, because I think scale is what we are experiencing as an issue. So when we look at things like this movie Contagion, for example, we have that connected thread from the virus, which is at the microscopic level, invisible, only visible in its effects on bodies, and also to a global threat in which the whole world has now been hit by this massive contagion of this, very specific, very deadly virus. One of the questions about thinking about the Earth as one is that the relationship is very asymmetrical. When these movies invent global threat, they can do it immediately. They can have zombies take over the world in 1 minute. Global threat is very easy to imagine. Global solutions are not. Right? So you can see the kind of asymmetry of why is it possible to imagine global threat, but then we hit the local when we're thinking about solutions, and it is a super local, right? A similar way to think about it would be why at the contemporary moment where the origins of certain things like capital, the connections that certain things like investments or like, your bank account or my data, my photographs from my last vacation, I don't know where they live. They live in some place that Google is managing, right? And they might be dispersed in 17 places. There's some way in which I am so connected to all these other parts of the world, but we also see the rise of very obsessive, very old-fashioned nationalisms in which we present a kind of like a retrogressive narrative of the coherence of national boundaries when they don't exist at the level of technology and they don't exist at the level of capital either. Right, those national boundaries are really an old-fashioned, still resonant ideological hold-on. Right, we're holding on to those nationalist discourses precisely because of the challenge that the global is having on us. In something like Contagion, we're looking at a lot of narratives of emergency response, global collectivity, global governance. You see all of the cities that are being mentioned there. And I want to give you just 1 minute about what's happening with disaster movies. That in disaster movies, that narrative of response and responsibility is major. You have all types of aliens, all types of threats. There could be accidents, there could be alien invasions, there could be nuclear apocalypse, there could be natural disasters like tsunamis and earthquakes. You could have somewhat fictional natural disasters like the Earth core melting, or and then within that you also have viruses that might create non-people, or that might create zombies, or that might decimate human populations. In order to figure out how that vocabulary makes sense, my proposal has been to actually think about what is the agent of the disaster, and can you negotiate with the agent of the disaster? Can you actually say, yes, you have to pick up the phone and call the Soviets because we cannot be having a nuclear apocalypse? If you can, then you have the responsibility to act, right? But if you can't, if it is a giant cockroach, I mean, maybe you can't really negotiate. Whether it's a tornado, like you're not going to talk to the comet and say, comet, can we reschedule? Right? So you don't have responsibility anymore. What you have is response, right? And so that vocabulary of natural disasters, I'm going to put all of them on, natural disasters being things that just inspire response, aliens, non-sentient aliens, monsters, zombie attacks, it's just pure response, just survive, right? Which highlights its own politics about government assistance, government planning, coordination of different agencies. So there's quite a lot of politics there. Response is not easy. But then you have this middle ground in which it is a mix between responsibility and response, right? You could do something about certain things, human-made disasters. You could do something. And so therefore, the story doesn't just say, it is a comet, just survive. The story is saying, maybe there's some way in which your politics should matter in how you survive. Your politics matter in how you survive. So in the 90s, when this disaster genre got kind of revitalized, a lot of the themes had to do with race relations, gender relations. The problem was not anymore us versus them, which was the 50s and 60s Cold War narrative of responsibility. The Earth is going to be destroyed because we're going to have a nuclear holocaust. Call up the Russian president, the Soviet president, and figure it out, right? It was all about what is the responsibility we have to avoid nuclear destruction. In the 90s, it is all natural disasters. So you don't have responsibility, all you have is response, but response activates how different we are. It's not actually us versus them anymore, it is us versus us. We have to coordinate in order to survive. And there was quite a lot of organizational thinking and militaristic thinking that was going on in the 90s to think about this. What we have in more recent years, actually not here, what we have in more recent years, especially after 9/11, is a much more mixed environment where we're always talking about human responsibility again, even when the spectacles themselves are huge, vicarious, grand spectacles of destruction. One example, for example, would be The Day After Tomorrow, where it is all about global warming, destroying cities through a new ice age. Sorry, The Day After Tomorrow, yes. Other examples now are in other forms of global threat. And so I have a couple of different conceptual rubrics for you in terms of this global threat. We see the rise of a type of militarization as the necessary response. And everything that becomes absolutely necessary for the survival of whoever these people are in the movie, the moment it becomes absolutely necessary, you know that something is being debated politically there, right? What are you willing to sacrifice because this is absolutely necessary? Right? So this is a way to understand even very, very popular, spectacular, multiplex genres as having political effects or political meanings. In World War Z, for example, anybody could become a zombie from the bite of a different zombie. Your family turns against you, neighbors turn against neighbors, nobody's safe, right? There is no sense of let's connect together. It is about dispersing the human population into rabid, animalistic, speedy demons. And the only help is the army. And the public sphere, the public, is either collateral or kind of like a hindrance, like, oh, there's so many of you that we have to save. So it becomes a managerial problem. How do you manage all these people instead of how are you going to save all these people? It's really kind of a strange translation these movies do. Some more images that are just really people in positions of authority, the army as the only thing that might help, and the only missions are knowledge missions that are related to the army, and civilians are often a problem. Civilians just, cumbersome. Another component that we see today is privatization. San Andreas, really fun, but basically this family survives only because the dad is actually a trained professional. And what he does is he doesn't really want to just save random people, the community in general, he's going to save his family. Right? So if you have your private army, you could do it, it's fine. Right? You get The Rock to come and save you in a helicopter. So all of it is about kind of like using the spectacles of community destruction, but without forming a community response. Because the response is complete privatization of survival, so that you can have the nuclear family as the unified model. Yes, of course, the family becomes a little tiny kind of space in which we also think about the expansions into other forms of community, but these movies often don't expand to say the family is a microcosm for the larger community. They're like, the family is the family, save your family. Something that happens in something like 2012 is the rise of narratives of totalitarianism. And so totalitarianism becomes kind of like, dislikable, but also kind of necessary because those are the only people who had a plan. What happens in 2012 is that the Earth's core starts melting. Parenthetically, cell phones still work up until the last minute, which is something I find immediately fascinating. Like, there is no material basis for how cell phones work. They just work. Where is the cell? It's everywhere. I have it right here. And one of the things that happens is a type of plutocracy that develops a plan in collaboration with only 8 governments from the G8, and the rest of the billions of people in the world die, right? And so there's a completely strange lack of transparency and lack of participation for most of the Earth. And then in that you have kind of, again, a family story, a family drama of a divorced family that gets at some point unified through the efforts of everyone. This is my slide. There's 2 dads and there's 4 cars, and there's a lot about which car you're going to take to work. The new couple is challenged by the disaster. Something is pulling us apart because the earthquake is beginning to draw the new couple apart. The family gets reunited at some point. All the survivors of Earth are on these 3 arcs on the same boat. Like all of the population of Earth is on the same boat. So literal, right? And they all have the same common vision. They all look like they're wearing similar outfits because they're wearing the ARC sweatshirt. So they all look like they're from the Gap. And it's just one vision, right? It's actually very dangerous to have visions of community that look like this. If we could all agree on just one thing. But in fact, the problem that we have today is we can't all agree on one thing. That's the thing we have to figure out, how to grow up in order to not be able to agree and still somehow function together. What you have with a movie like Contagion is the depiction of a type of globalization. And so I'm getting back into the circle of thinking about global threats and global solutions. You have a lot of self-conscious, ultra-realistic narratives. You have people who are clearly professionals in the movie from the CDC, from the World Health Organization. You have the depiction in a slightly cold and clinical tone of what the process would be. organizational tone of what the process would be of how you would respond to such a pandemic. You have the international network, and you also have a lot of commitment from the team that made the movie on representing realistic disease transmissions. So they actually did their homework and they worked on H1N1, on Ebola, on SARS in order to talk about how the outbreak would work. What you have is also a lot of focusing on how to manage that microscopic world. Right? What does it mean? What does it look like to manage that microscopic world? You have a lot of disorganized minimalist spaces that are the spaces in which this management is happening. Here's another one. This is Weinberger, and so a lot of the stuff that I was saying, cold and clinical, I don't mean clinical like what you guys are doing. I mean, he really wants it to look cold. It's really about the cold spaces. And then a lot of these other organizational spaces where decisions have to be made. A lot of it is very impersonal in the movie. It's these impersonal people in one boardroom after another. I think I have like 3 or 4 slides that are just boardrooms because it's all about news of that. Government buildings that are supposed to be decision spaces. And then, some of them, again, mediated through media. And then the public sphere, which is at complete shambles. Right? So there's something about how these movies are giving us, what I was saying before, a world of absolute disorder and a narrative of control, right? And we have to, that's why I gave you the example in the middle about totalitarianism, militarization, the kind of attraction of those models of, well, at least somebody knows how to fly an airplane, right? The attraction of those models is partly because the world is represented as being so out of control, non-understandable. The public sphere dissolves in minutes. Any sort of communication dissolves in minutes. This isn't the reality of what happens in moments of crisis, actually. In moments of crisis, people who have worked on crisis spaces, there's quite a lot of misunderstanding and disorder, but nobody becomes rabid, animalistic, and inhuman at those moments. People also are trying to help each other. All of that is happening at the same time. Again, the idea of raiding the supermarkets and the pharmacies, greed and violence, and the spectacles of a world gone mad, and also a different type of emptiness, and the people who are profiteering from those worlds. By the end of the film, what you have is you also have a very specific family melodrama in which all of these uncontrollable places land in the family as a type of explanatory method, right? The family will explain and will help you understand what's going on. Beth is an executive of a company that was traveling in Southeast Asia in order to launch the opening of a new factory. She's the first patient, and she's the person who transmits the disease in the United States, in addition to other people that were on the plane with her who transmit the disease to other places. The family becomes ground zero, and there is actually quite a kind of a strange, sneaky intervention there of adding a melodramatic dimension, because you find out that one of the ways in which Beth transmitted the disease is that she was having an affair with someone whom she met at the airport Hilton or something. Now, the affair makes no sense. If the disease is so virulent, you can transmit it by touching a credit card. So why do you need to have a sexual affair in the middle in order to really criminalize her, right? So there's something really specific about giving body, right, giving ethical and moral dimension to something, and otherwise you cannot find a dimension to. And viruses are magnificent villains. They have no intentions, but they have a lot of effects. Right? They don't intend to kill anybody, they just do what they do. And they don't actually feel anything. When you win and you make a vaccine, the virus has no emotion about it, the virus doesn't care. The virus might go dormant in another species and wait until the conditions are right again. So there's some kind of strange emotional emptiness in thinking about the virus that the movie then adds things to in order to supply that kind of emotional component, including very sentimental things about the young woman having her homecoming party or graduation party in the living room. And then also all of these other heroic professionals who sacrifice themselves in order to save others. So this is the CDC employee. This is the researcher in a lab who actually injects herself in order to make sure that the vaccine is safe. And this is Beth, and the end of the movie, where we have the origin story of how the virus was transmitted. And when we have that beginning, right, this is her at the airport, she's already beginning to get a little bit sick. The movie ends, we have the credits, and then you have the tiny origin narrative that makes no sense otherwise, in which we see this beautiful silent sequence of bats flying in a kind of like jungle space. They start eating some bananas. Turns out that the bananas are then eaten by pigs in a pig facility that has been installed at the edge of the jungle, partly because of the displacement that Beth's company made of the particular location there. That's the factor that she was there to inaugurate. One of the piglets is taken to the restaurant. The chef cleans it and cooks it. The chef shakes hands with her, and that's how the virus was transmitted zoonotically from the bats to the pigs, from the pigs to the humans. If they make it instant, like this one piglet, like they don't leave any space for mutation development for the virus to actually have victims in other species, right? But they make a complete origin story of how the virus was transmitted. What that creates is a narrative of responsibility, right? In addition to thinking about what all of these spaces and spectacles of destruction have done in the film, you also are given then a melodramatic story in which Beth is morally suspect because she was having an affair. And also that the company that she works for is morally suspect because they're the ones who took down the jungle that made bats and pigs come into such proximity that they would allow that sense of connection. So what we have here is another one of those strange situations in which distance has gotten eliminated, right? Certain distances that we want to have as a type of safeguard. The distance between what are the corporate headquarters, which I think is Minneapolis, is where Beth works, and what are the places where the effects are happening, which are in Southeast Asia. What are the limits of the boundary of the one body, and what are the things that can actually permeate that body, right? How permeable that body becomes, and then what gets to be the contagion from one space to another. So I'm ending with just all of these different questions of like connecting the local and the global that we see both in genetics research, in how we understand the small world and the big world, right? In the way that ecology as a concept has started permeating discourses of the inside of the human body, right? An ecology of bacteria, but also an ecology of capitalism, which is what we see in the movie about globalization, right? The headquarters are in Minneapolis, but the action might be happening in Macau, but the effects of that might be felt in London or in Singapore or anywhere else, right? So something about connectivity as a question that is floating about all of these different things. And we see the origin story that the movie makes from the virus to animal transmission, human transmission to pandemic, from one body to another, and also from one scale to another, right? The microscopic scale of the virus and the global scale of the epidemic. We see the idea that there is like a kind of like a strange travel of a corporate reach from one side of the world to another, and then the virus is doing a type of answer from that side over, right? So some strange balance or choreography about causes and effects. And this is why I'm thinking about what contagion is doing as a type of mental or conceptual public rubric for understanding this idea of the dissolution of boundaries. We have the potential to see these ethical questions in a new framework when we are thinking about what has happened to the boundaries of the human, right? The scale of the human when integrated into these very, very different places in terms of scale, the very small and the very big. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Dr. Kakudaki, for that fascinating lecture. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Kakudaki?
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic and just wide-ranging and comprehensive lecture. I'm thinking about that movement back and forth between chaos and control, and in particular around. So you were using viruses and contagion, but I'm thinking about it in terms of genetics as well, right? The idea of manipulation of the genetic to control what are perceived as errors in the genetic code, or problems or flaws in the in how the genetic code manifests in the lived body. So the idea of, well, if we can get close enough in our imaging, if we can get fine enough in our manipulation, we'll be able to control it. But it again, in the popular kind of imagination, so that's the kind of rubric of control, but in the popular imagination, there seems to be that underpinning of and if we try to control, we will breed chaos, right? That it will be out of control. Is that just an unavoidable kind of problem or question with technology, with genetic technology, with medical technology in any way?
To me, it feels, thank you for this question. To me, it feels like that vocabulary of control is constant in discussions of technology. It's also coupled with a vocabulary of the technology over here. The technology doesn't have any moral or ethical implications. It's about how you use it. So that's the other counterpart that we see quite a lot in all kinds of technological innovations. It feels like if I had one way of persuading people to change their approach to this, it would be about how not to have a complete freak out about notions of control and lack of control. And in some contexts, we actually are very able to kind of migrate or expand our sense of the body in order to understand the body. Like, for example, even the biodome example that the biome example that I was giving before. You can understand the self as, oh, I see, I am also part of this larger environment. I am affected by what happens at the level of the weather and what happens at the level of the soil in this farm. And I should figure out a way to be at some kind of peace with that or aware of that. And if I want to have political control of that, to focus on both of those places, right? Instead of, I control everything that I eat, and it becomes a type of another version of narcissistic Western navel gazing, right? Of like, oh, my body, oh, I could tell you what the chickens ate, that, you know, whatever. So there's a way of making that narrative in which the body is permeable, a narrative in which you want to enact more control, or make the narrative in which more things suddenly matter, right? Like when I say, for example, that my photographs from my last vacation might be living in some Google data bank that might be in Iowa, or it might be in Nigeria, or it might be in Georgia, right? Politically, this creates very interesting questions. Should I care? Should I care if they have stable electricity in Georgia? Do I care only at the level of my data? Should I care if those people that might be going in to fix the air conditioning in the data campus, should I care about what they are getting paid? At this point, I don't have to care because Google takes care of that, right? But I have somehow allowed Google to have certain privatization or ownership of my photographs. And I also have not made the gesture to say, oh, if my photographs live in Iowa, I should care what happens in Iowa. I should care if Iowa has power surges, or I should care if Iowa has a tornado. And this is where we are right now. Like, we're still in the place in which everything is where I am. My photographs are right here. Like everything, the internet is right here, instead of that the internet is in locations and places that have demands, material demands, and that might change particular spaces, like the employment situation in a particular state changes when Google makes a data bank there, because you need different technicians, you need different builders. So those are kind of strange questions now, to me, it feels. But if we can think about, instead of reacting as what I was saying as like imagining control as the answer, that has political implications. We are imagining that the way in which we are imagining this makes it possible for us to imagine the erosion of certain democratic principles, or to imagine the erosion of certain traditions of human respect or human interaction and communication. So if you know, there's some way in which the control narrative, if you let it run its course, leads to totalitarian fantasies. Right? The world in which I know what's coming in, I know what's coming up, I know what everybody's producing, and that's like, you know, a Cold War vocabulary of kind of like a Cold War stereotype. A lot of stuff was going on in the Soviet Union in the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War that was not at all controllable. So I think that that's really where I see the pervasiveness of the problem of this model. Yes. Oh, sorry. I mean, do you guys think that we are thinking about ourselves as ecologists now, in your experience? Does that thing that I was describing, in which the self becomes a strangely permeable and expansive and connecting thing, is that happening in your experience?
So I have the mic, so I will ask a question.
Yeah.
Kind of, I think, connecting to this point, this question you're asking us, this idea about the distinction between response and responsibility, I find find really interesting, and our attempts to kind of, it seems to me like seems to be suggesting imposing or artificially constructing responsibility in the face of what, would actually be appropriately classed as response. So one kind of thought is, or one kind of implication possibly is, if we're actually appreciating sort of how things are, we need to think about what an ethic, or what an ethical approach or a political approach would look like that isn't centered around this idea of exercising control, which seems to be kind of central to how we even think about ethics or politics, right? The reason we think of something as an ethical question or a political question is because there's this background assumption that it's something over which we have control, or could have control. So what would an ethics, I mean, this is a huge question, you don't have to answer it, but maybe if you just have any thoughts, what might an ethics or an ethical or political approach look like that rejects that assumption?
Yeah, I don't know if it rejects it, but I think that the complication is that when we think about these limits at the human scale, very often we think about the individual human. And so that's why the individual human as the model becomes so subjected to this problem of control, narcissism, egomania, right? Or isolation. The in-between model would be to think about between the model of the human versus a completely global environment of like global citizenry, right? The in-between model is actually much more communal. So instead of thinking about privatizing, kind of building closer and closer to the human scale, closer to the individual self, is to imagine what would be the in-between steps to expanding, which might not be expanding the self, right? But it might be expanding the self through connection with others. So the idea would be that 5 people together are a much bigger unit than 1 person. 10 people together are a much bigger unit than 1 person. You never have that idea of an idealized mode of communication in which we all think alike. You have to have meetings and exchange ideas and deal with other people's desires and egos and their annoyingness, right? But that is, I think, where you get into an in-between space where it is not about exerting more individual control or privatizing or bordering, right? Bolstering the borders of the self, but imagining expanding action. And most of the models in which you have expansive action are models of communal action. It's very difficult to say this in the United States because we have such a mythology of the individual and such a mythology of individual action, individual with genius, individual ability. And I think that but that's why it helps to see that relationship, that narratives of control are responses to a world that's more complex. And every generation when I see with my students are not as, are much more invested in communal actions. They're much more invested in thinking about each other. They are much more involved in peer groups that matter to them and that they follow in a particular connection. We make fun of them because they're all on Twitter all day long or whatever, but they also have a very different idea about the permeability of what their life is and how much they themselves are subject to other egos and wills, how they want to negotiate those. So generational, I think that has changed. And I think that in terms of cultural attitude, it has changed. And of course, this is different in different places. So it's different here than it is in DC right now.
I was wondering where denial comes into all this. Has that changed? Is there less denial because of the social media? Is there more denial, or both?
What do you mean by denial, and what context are you thinking of it?
Well, obviously the easiest is global warming, but you can deny malfunctions, you can deny sabotage, you can deny any of the things that are listed there because you don't wish to see them.
Right, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that this is where the problem comes in that I was describing as boarding up the self. People are talking about it as an echo chamber in terms of the media now, in which you only subscribe to the news outlets that you agree with already, and so it reinforces certain things that are also a type of isolation. Yeah, I mean the problematic nature of the thing that I'm arguing here is that you can argue it in terms of media, you can argue it in terms of genetics, you can argue it in terms of disaster movies, and I feel that I'm losing my boundaries in how the argument works. That it is not. This is not a careful reading of particular iterations. It's about the global thinking or the kind of big scale thinking of it. But denial, especially when it comes to like, for example, in terms of global warming, there is something that is problematic about imagining a magnification of human action, but also a minimization of human action. That's happening, both of them are happening at the same time. So on the one hand, we say this is this global warming, the contemporary situation we see with climate is partly human responsibility. We have made this happen because of our reliance on fossil fuels, because of our reliance on particular means of transportation, production of energy. We have done it. So magnification of human action, but then also minimization of human responsibility in other ways, which is like, well, one light bulb is not going to do it, or I can't change the way in which I travel, or right. So it's like very self-affirming, like both, you know, magnified action and also not magnified action. We don't magnify what we have to do. We change the scale of that. Yes.
Thank you for that talk. It was very interesting. Just quickly, I think maybe we're out of time, judging by people. Are we good? Okay. I was wondering, so in response to this discussion about kind of response narratives, you get these kind of control narratives as a response to something, right? And I'm trying to think in the genetic space, you know, what happens when we make these genetic discoveries is one of the things that happens is that I have to find new resources to conceive of myself as a whole body or something like that. And so it seems like the control, I have two options. I can use the resources of the science world and the medical world, which is quite alienating, I would think, as someone who's not in the science world, or I can use the resources and the concepts of the control narrative, right? I feel like you have two extremes. And both are not good options, I would say, to someone who's part of maybe kind of in the middle or the general public. And it seems like maybe we are missing in many of these cases kind of shared resources for like interpreting ourselves in the social world, right? We have two extremes and they're not, they're often mutually exclusive. So I'm wondering if you see that as part of the problem, as part of a solution being offering a different kind of narrative between these two extremes, or if you think that there's a case in history where we have a good example of a kind of narrative that resists this like extreme control narrative, but also makes more sense of my whole human body and kind of social existence, if that makes sense.
I don't have a historical example.
Yeah.
I think that that's a really good question in terms of what models we might have. What strikes me as fascinating is that in a contemporary moment, let's say in terms of health, you have the coexistence of extremely advanced, very sophisticated, very complex medical narratives, as you're saying, in terms of figuring out things or being able to see inside the body. And you also have, at the same time, narratives that are very pre-modern. Some of the things that we experience right now are things in which diet, exercise, and a positive attitude is actually a pretty good prescription for a lot of stuff. That is a completely pre-modern medical level of advice. We have more proof that some of that stuff works, but it is also kind of like a very strange development to be at such a cutting edge of medical technology and also to be reaffirming old wives' tales. And not all of them, but like some. Like it feels like there's some kind of way in which what I was describing before as a black box model of the body in which certain things remain mysterious. To me, it feels like recognizing that mystery is actually really, really wonderful. The general public thinks that once you get into that type of image, you have definitive answers. Or once you get to sequence the DNA, you have definitive answers. And researchers immediately say, no, you just get different questions. You get more questions. Or you recognize the absolutely mind-boggling dynamic complexity of what's going on. Is it possible that I am able to learn a foreign language because some protein did something one day? Like, you know, it's just unbelievable. And so I think probably from the educator's point of view, it feels like we need to figure out how to understand and also dispel some of the fantasies that are going on in public about control and also about final forms of knowledge. which I think sometimes the technology, the rate at which technology is innovating is somehow fueling these fantasies of final knowledge instead of realities of more questions, more interesting questions, more complicated questions, and also more engagement with the process of discernment, right? That we are still in a dynamic relationship with what we know and what we have to be able to do about it. Yeah.
So we are out of time, unfortunately. Can I thank Dr. Kakudaki for a
Thank you.
fascinating
Thank you very
lecture?
much. Thank you.
Can I thank you all for your attendance? I know that today there actually were numerous offerings that you could have chosen from, sadly, but that you chose to come here. Can I invite anyone who wants to join us at 1:30 in the Ethics Library, which is in room 66234 here in the hospital, to continue the conversation with Dr. Kakudaki after she has had something to eat. Thank you again.
Thank you.